Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at postmodernism, and we'll be focusing on two buildings in particular: the Vanna Venturi House, designed by Robert Venturi, and then the Neue Staatsgalerie, designed by James Stirling. Now, in the past lecture, we saw a critique of modern art. Modern art avoided any sort of narrative in the painting other than perhaps some idea about how the painter actually applied pigment onto the canvas. It certainly did not refer to any great works of literature or history or scripture. And it also was not figurative, meaning that it did not insist on depicting something that all of us would recognize from from life or from our daily experience. And furthermore, there was no attempt to accurately depict three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Rather, modern art was just going to be about the pigment applied onto a flat surface, usually a stretched canvas on a wooden frame, nothing more than that. The general public had been skeptical of modern art all along, but in the middle of the 20th century, we begin to get um, even theorists and art critics begin to question the basic premise of modern art. If it's possible for painting to be more than just pigment on a stretched canvas, then shouldn't it be? Isn't it capable of doing more than just being interesting because of the colors on a flat surface? And one response to that we saw in the 1960s with the pop art of Andy Warhol, where it was figurative and there was a sort of narrative in this. But he certainly wasn't going back to the great examples of the great examples of historical art. He wasn't looking at narratives from literature, scripture, or history. Rather, he was looking at things that every American would know and recognize, and the narrative would come from what every American had in his or her experience about the subject matter. And similarly with architecture, the modernist designers from the radical post-World War I era, or some of them who followed closely in their footsteps in the decades following, were not interested in having an architecture that communicated with the forms of architecture. Rather, some of them focused on a very rational and well resolved program and just allowing the building to enclose the space required for the program. Many of them focused on using modern materials, modern mass produced materials, in a logical, straightforward way. Many of them were structural rationalists, wanting to have the most efficient structural system possible and to expose that. Um, and so we get buildings that are solutions in many ways, but that really don't communicate the way that historical architecture had. And just as we saw in the art world in the 1950s, 1960s, we begin to get some critics and some architects even beginning to ask, well, if architecture can be more than just a building solution, shouldn't it? Shouldn't architecture also communicate with the forms that we use? And in the post-World War II period, we begin to see that there are some designers, like Stirling, who really do focus on form as having some sort of connection to people's experience. And with Stirling and Gowan's design for the engineering building at Leicester, we can see a careful selection of forms and details because they believed that people would understand these things, and drawing inspiration from contexts that architects hadn't traditionally looked at, such as gritty urban industrial contexts, industrial buildings, things that had gone unnoticed or unappreciated. they were interested in using those as sources of inspiration for their buildings. But they were still interested in doing a modern architecture. There's a slight difference when we get to postmodernism between what Stirling had been doing and what the postmodernists were proposing. And that slight difference is that the postmodernists were not interested in continuity with the great experiment of modernist architecture. Rather, they wanted to come up with a sort of architecture that was postmodern, something that was going to put an end to the modernist experiment and move forward in a different direction. And as we saw in the last lecture, sort of a boilerplate definition for postmodernism is to find signs and symbols in the contemporary architectural context and to use them in a building design to communicate. And the person who really pulled it together was Robert Venturi. And Venturi was born in Philadelphia, and he studied at Princeton, and somewhat later he got an architectural fellowship to the American Academy in Rome. And the American Academy was set up by the Beaux-Arts schools of architecture that were developed in different East Coast universities in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But Venturi went there and, in a way, discovered the classical tradition in a way that he wouldn't have discovered it from his training in the middle of the 20th century. And with that, he comes back to the United States and begins teaching and practicing architecture. But he also publishes a couple of texts that in many ways can be seen as the theoretical underpinnings for postmodern architecture. Texts like Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, and also Learning from Las Vegas. And what we see from those texts is that, first of all, he believes that the great examples of modern architecture are overly simplified. They really reduce down the program so that the designer only has to address a few particular points and sort of leaves other things off the table or out of sight, out of mind. And so the buildings are great, simple things, but they don't really address the full complexity of buildings in the 20th century. Venturi, on the other hand, believed that architectural form carried meaning in one way or the other, and that was good, and that architects ought to make use of that. But he's going to advocate not necessarily getting meaning from the classical tradition, not necessarily getting meaning from the great examples of classical architecture, but rather taking a look at what Americans know and recognize. And for him, what Americans know and recognize are suburbs and urban sprawl. He believes that the modern urban environment has a lot of contradictory information in it, and that we can use that in designing our own complicated architecture. We don't need to oversimplify. We can allow all the building systems, every aspect of a building, and also the various and layered meanings of architectural form. And we can allow all of that to come together in some very complicated designs, and that was a good thing, those complications. He's not presenting a new social ideal. He doesn't have the program of arts and crafts architecture or even of the idealist post-World War I modernist architecture. Rather, he's just allowing the status quo to exist and to inform his own designs. The one building that we're going to take a look at by Venturi is the Vanna Venturi House, which was designed for his mother in the suburbs of Philadelphia in the 1960s. Now, if he has a house to design in a city's suburbs, it just stands to reason, based on what I've said and the location of his design, that he's going to take a look at suburban architecture of the post-World War II period in the United States. And he's going to try to understand what it is that Americans know and recognize as domestic architecture or as house. And here we're going to be taking a look at some images from an exhibit that he organized in which he shows what he learned by going to the post-World War II suburbs and what he learned about American understanding of domestic architecture. And if we take a look at this image, and specifically the labels that he put on a blown up photograph of a suburban house, we can see some of the things that he identifies as important for American domestic architecture. Formal colonial gardens, colonial sidelights, Cape Cod shingles, federal style scallops. What he saw was that it was the colonial architecture of the eastern seaboard of the United States that for many Americans provided the starting off point for what domestic architecture in the United States was. There were details, there were materials, there were ways that these buildings were put together that informed what we understand of as domestic architecture. Some of these, interestingly, come from the classical tradition. The formal colonial gardens, the colonial sidelights, the federal style scallops, all come from the introduction into the eastern seaboard of English classical architecture. And so he wasn't setting out to inspire a classical revival necessarily. It just so happened that in suburban America, many of the houses are drawing from a classical tradition, and some of them quite overtly. Here we're taking a look at the Governor's Palace from Williamsburg, Virginia, on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we're taking a look at a suburban house that in the materials, in the details, in many of the forms, seems to draw inspiration from that sort of colonial architecture. And so for him, it's the classical tradition as it informed the domestic architecture of the eastern seaboard that informed what Americans know as domestic architecture. And a lot of that had to do with the architecture of Palladio. Here we're taking a look at two interesting, large, well-designed houses from the colonial period. In the upper left-hand corner, we're taking a look at Mount Airy, which is an estate house in Virginia from the middle of the 18th century. And from about the same time, but a little bit later, we have on the lower right the Longfellow House, which is in Massachusetts. So different English colonies, different parts of the eastern seaboard. But when we take a look at them, we can both see elements of the classical tradition. And we also see that in the center of the design, we've got a rudimentary temple portico. That combination of freestanding columns, pediment, pitched roof, that was often the exterior image of ancient Greek temples and also ancient Roman temples. In both of these cases, it's much simplified, but we can see that combination and a reinterpretation of that combination in the central bays of both of these examples. And the use of the temple portico in domestic architecture was something that had been popularized by Andrea Palladio and had been introduced into English architecture by means of Palladio's treatise. Here we're taking a look at the residential part of a villa that Palladio designed in the Veneto, the region around Venice in the 16th century. And if we take a look at this residential building, the front facade, which you see down in the lower right, we're going to see that there is a freestanding temple portico which is attached to the residence proper. It stands out in front of the residence proper as a sort of porch. It has the freestanding structural columns. It's supporting a pediment. There is a pitched roof that actually sheds water, which is sort of the structural and environmental logic behind the temple portico that we can see here. But if we take a look at the backside of that same residence, and the backside is seen in the upper left, we're going to see that even on the backside there is a residual reference to that temple portico. We don't have the freestanding structural columns. We don't have an extended porch. We don't have any indication of columnar forms or pilasters, but we do see a little pediment there. We do see the outline of the pediment interrupted by the circular form of the windows, which is sort of inserted into that central bay. Very interesting combination between a three-dimensional structural freestanding temple portico appended onto the front of the building, and then what we see on the back of the building. But if we take a look at this particular example, and we can see different plans and sections and elevations of it here on in these images, we're going to see that freestanding temple portico, the width of it, actually runs through the depth of the house as a sort of spatial unit that then extends and bumps out the backside just a little bit. And if we take a look at how it extends through the house, we're going to see that much of that width is occupied by a cruciform interior space that has what appears to be a vaulted covering over it. It's actually a false vault. It is executed in wood, lath, and plaster, so it's not a real structural vault. But it does intersect in a groin at the crossing of that cruciform form. But it also extends to the back of the building. And the windows that are overlooking the part of the yard in the back of the building have the outline of that residual barrel vault. Right, you can see the curvilinear form there in the upper windows there. And that's what informs the shape and the configuration of the windows that we see on the backside. But on the backside, we can see that Palladio is allowing both the windows that provide air and light to the interior space, the geometry and the fictive structure of the interior space, all to be experienced on the back facade of the building. And he allows different layers to be seen there. The layer of the temple portico in a residual way, and the layer of the windows and the curve of the false vault on the inside also to be seen in the back of the building. So it was Palladio who popularized the use of temple porticos in residential architecture. He was not the first Renaissance architect to use the temple portico in residential architecture, but he's the guy who picked up on it. All of them, Palladio and the earlier designers, quite rightly believed that the form of the ancient Roman and Greek temple was something that was derived from prehistoric domestic architecture. And so temples, in many ways, were just houses of the gods that were monumental and that were turned into something in very fine materials and fine details that was far above and beyond the residence of human beings at the time. But they believed that there was this connection. And so in their mind, they could go back from temple portico and bring that form back to domestic architecture. Palladio picked up on it, he developed it, he used it in a number of his residences, most importantly in his villas. And then in his treatise, he demonstrated how the temple portico could be used. The treatise traveled widely. It made it to England, where it was picked up by the landed gentry and the aristocrats in England. And many of their residences, especially the rural manor houses of the landed gentry in England, followed the precedent that was set by many of Palladio's villas. And that in turn was imported into the United States, and we can see many of those precedents from English domestic architecture begin to show up in the manor houses on the southern plantation or in some of the houses that we can see up in the northern parts of the eastern seaboard. And this really lay at the root of what the eastern seaboard, at any rate, considered to be domestic architecture. And it also lay at the root of what post-World War II suburban houses were modeled on in one way or the other. Sometimes in very shorthand ways, sometimes in ways that were sort of fumbling and not particularly sophisticated, but still, this is what Americans thought domestic architecture was in the post-World War II period. And that's what Venturi is going to pick up on. And the legacy continues today. In the upper left, we see the Longfellow House. In the lower right, we see a house that was built in the 1990s that very clearly is based upon the Longfellow House in a very, well, it copies the Longfellow House, right? It's a very straightforward sort of imitation of it, and a very faithful imitation of it too, although it's larger and there are some additions onto it. So this continues to inform what we think of as domestic architecture. And this is the starting off point for what Venturi was going to do at his mother's house. And so if we take a look at the Vanna Venturi house, we're going to see that there is this pediment. There is, right at the base of the design, the triangular form to the pitched roof that is going to be sort of the major element here in the design of the house. Now, I want you to take a look at this image for a minute and imagine that you're actually there. Imagine that you're walking up to that house and that you're walking up to the front door. Imagine how tall you are in relation to the house. Okay, try to get a sense of scale. Try to imagine exactly how tall you would be. And now take a look at these images and tell me if your sense of scale was accurate or not. When we take a look at the house in relation to the cars or the house in relation to the people who are close to the house, you might be surprised to see how small the house actually is. And this was something that Venturi was fully aware of and that he was interested in playing with in the design of his mother's house. The overall form of the house, because of its unification under that pitch of the pediment there, the way that it's got such a strong, clear, basic geometry to it, and the way that we understand that geometry based on our experience or what we know of the colonial architecture may present the house as something monumental. It may present the house as something large. But when we actually get there, we may be surprised at how small in scale the house actually is. This is one interesting example that we learned from the reading of the sort of complexity that Venturi was aware of and was playing with in his design of the house. When we take a look at the house, we're going to see that that pediment establishes a central axis in the design of the house. But it's interesting to see the way in which he quite intentionally breaks that symmetry down. We would expect there to be a perfect symmetry about the central axis. But when we begin to take a look at it, we see that there are things that are a little bit off. For example, if we take a look at the chimney, which rises above the center point of that pediment there, we can see that the actual flue for the exhaust of the smoke is off to one side. If we take a look at the windows on the ground floor, we're going to see 5 square window panes on the left and 5 square window panes on the right. So same number, but they're organized differently. If we take a look at the plan, we can see that the 5 on the right are all lined up over the counter in the kitchen, whereas the 5 on the left are separated and provide light into different rooms. The single square pane provides light into the bathroom, and then the 4 square panes that are organized, 2 on top and 2 on bottom, provide light to a spare bedroom. And so same number, but it begins to fall apart. If we take a look at the pediment itself, we can see that the pitch does not finish in an apex where the 2 angles actually meet, but they're actually pulled apart. Now, this is something that we can see in some examples of ancient architecture, usually a sort of late imperial ancient architecture or a Hellenistic Greek ancient architecture, where the architects were interested in sort of playing with expectations. But here we can see that Venturi's also playing with your expectations. You might think that the pitch of the roof is there for an environmental purpose, right? To actually shed the water. But in pulling it apart there, you can see that he's sort of negating that logic to it. Furthermore, if we enter into the porch there, we're going to see that axis, the central axis that is suggested in some ways here, also breaks down in the circulation. You can't enter in right on the central axis. Rather, you have to rotate to the right and enter by some paired doors there, and then sort of rotate around this combination fireplace and staircase. But also, when you get under the lintel there, we see that we're not protected from the elements by a pitched roof. And furthermore, what appeared to be the bulk of the building and the way that the facade encloses interior space, for that central section, it doesn't actually enclose interior space. It's a two-dimensional thing, more or less, with the porch open to the sky above. So these are all things that Venturi was doing, not because he was a bad architect, although you could criticize the design, not because he was unaware of these things. He was perfectly aware of what these different forms meant, what their logic was, how they'd been used in the past. But he was interested in using all of that just as a point of departure, because that's what Americans know and recognize in domestic architecture, but then playing with it in a variety of ways. So let's take a look in plan at that staircase and fireplace on the ground floor. As you can see, the fireplace restricts the width of the staircase. You can see that the angled wall there that allows you to have those paired front doors actually eats into the space, the lower steps of the staircase. And you can see that there's a very uncomfortable spot there where the corner of the fireplace and the angle from the wall to the outside actually comes together. And if we go in, we can see just how uncomfortable rather, that is, right? And the way that the wall from the fireplace comes down at a very low location, something almost that you could trip on if you weren't paying attention as you entered through the front door or as you came down the steps of leading to the upstairs. Now imagine that you presented a combination staircase and fireplace like this in one of your design studios. What do you think your design professor would say if he or she saw that in a design for a house? They would probably call you out on it and tell you that this was not a good design. And as a matter of fact, they'd be right. And Venturi knew that they'd be right, but he wasn't interested in a well-designed staircase. He wasn't interested in a well-designed fireplace. He was interested in what happens when these two elements come together and conflict with each other. And that's where he was going to seek some interest in the design of the building. The building has some parts to it that are rather nonsensical. For example, there's a staircase in the upper part of the building that leads only to a light socket and appears to be a permanent part of the building, only intended to allow somebody to change the light bulb in that light socket. And there are other parts of the building, specifically in the upstairs, where we see this really interesting combination of window form and ceiling. And again, all of this was very well thought out in the design of the building. We might look at it and critique it. We might look at it and think it's bad design. But all of it was something that Venturi thought about very carefully. And there were some really interesting surprises for the people in the building. But overall, he's not interested in individual elements that are well designed. He wanted to bring everything together to allow things to coexist in often some very uncomfortable ways, and to allow the surprising matchup and the surprising conflict to create interest within the building. And that's what he felt was going to be interesting about postmodern architecture. Now let's take a look at what James Stirling was doing. We saw that he was one of the post-World War II designers who understood modernism, but was not satisfied with the sort of bland, very lightweight modern urbanism and architectural design that was being used in the reconstruction of Britain. Rather, he and other young designers were interested in things that were much more powerful, much more aggressive designs. And they were looking at examples and contexts that were often misunderstood by the modernists or unappreciated by anybody. And Stirling and his business associates and the other people contemporary with him were interested in using these forms to communicate. So we might imagine that somebody who was already interested in forms that communicate, we might imagine that he was going to be interested in postmodernism. Here was architectural theory that was beginning to investigate how forms communicate and what forms communicated and how that could be a point of departure for a new sort of architecture. And so if we fast forward 25 years, and if we take a look at what James Stirling is doing in the 1970s and 1980s, we're going to see that he very much participates in the postmodern experiment. In the late 1970s, he and his firm received the commission for an addition to a city art museum in Stuttgart in southwestern Germany. And so there's a site which existed next to the pre-existing City Art Museum, and he's given responsibility to design the addition. So like we saw, Venturi was looking at what Americans know and recognize as domestic architecture. So Stirling is going to look for what Germans know and recognize as museum. And he's going to fall back on the neoclassical design of Carl Friedrich Schinkel for the Altes Museum in Berlin. And if we take a look at these images here, we see different views of the Altes Museum. In plan, we can see that it is a rectangle in plan. We see that you enter not on the short side, but on the long side, right in the center, and that there's this long colonnade that creates a porch through which you enter into the building. The details here are very much from ancient Greek architecture on the exterior of the building. But if we go into the center of the building, and you can see the circular form right in the center, we come into this space which is circulation but also sculpture gallery that is very clearly based upon the Pantheon in Rome. If we take a look at the ground floor colonnade of freestanding columns, if we take a look at an attic level above, and if we take a look at the hemispherical shape of the dome up over that, all of this recalls the design of the Pantheon. So some great ancient Greek architecture, some great ancient Roman architecture. But on the outside of the building, Schinkel was very careful to avoid things which could be mistaken for religious architecture, despite the fact that his sources were religious. The Pantheon had been originally designed as the temple dedicated to all the gods, Pantheon. But rather than show the domed form on the exterior of the building, a form which could have been mistaken for religious architecture, Schinkel enclosed the dome within a square box, and you can just see the top of the square box over the colonnade on the exterior view of the Altes Museum. So hiding the dome so that it's not mistaken for religious architecture. Similarly, even though that long colonnade and the porch along one side draws inspiration from Greek architecture and specifically Greek temples, he doesn't allow the freestanding colonnade to enclose the building on all four sides, nor does he allow the temple portico to be seen on the short sides of the building. The temple portico could have been mistaken for religious architecture, and he wants to move away from that. And so he only allows the colonnade to be seen on the long side without any temple portico, thereby reducing the religious connotations of the design. But the plan of this building, the exterior forms of this building, the spaces of this building are all things that in Stirling's mind is what Germans know and recognize as museum. And so this is going to be the point of departure for the Neue Staatsgalerie. And if we take a look at his design for that gallery down in the model on the lower right hand of the lower right hand image here, we're going to see the way that he allowed himself to reinterpret the design for the Altes Museum. The whole thing is this rectangular space. It has a sort of porch to the front, but it's not a porch that's enclosed with a continuous colonnade. Rather, it's a porch that is an elevated platform that sort of runs along the sidewalk there. In the middle of the space, there is this circular sculpture court, but it's not an enclosed space with a semicircular or a hemispherical dome. Rather, if we take a look at the model, we can see this cylindrical space in the middle of the Altes Museum, which is the corresponding space. If we take a look at the perimeter of the rectangle in the Altes Museum, we can see the gallery space that runs around the outside of the rectangular site plan. Similarly, Stirling is going to organize the interior gallery space on a couple of different levels around the perimeter of the rectangular site plan for the Neue Staatsgalerie. So in many ways, he's drawing inspiration from what Schinkel is doing, but he's also allowing himself to develop upon it and to change it, right? It's only a point of departure for where he's going to go with it. Now, the building was completed in the early 1980s. And there was one summer when I was in Western Europe and I was traveling around on my way to my undergrad's study abroad program in Florence. I had started up in Britain and was traveling through, and a cousin of mine who was studying architecture at the University of Waterloo in Canada had an internship with an architectural firm in Stuttgart. And so obviously I'm going to stop by and see him and spend some time there in Stuttgart. And while I was there, he said, there's this new building that opened that Stirling designed. Let's go see it. I said, all right. So one morning we got on the bus and we went across town and we got off in front of the Neue Staatsgalerie. The street in front is a pretty broad, busy street, and there is a city park which is on the other side of the street from the Neue Staatsgalerie. And so we got off the bus and walked across the street and got up there. And he said, I want to see where you go when you walk through this building. So you just lead the way, and I'll be here behind you. All right, fair enough. So we walk up to the front of the building, and obviously that little portico that we see there is where you enter, right? There's a retaining wall which prohibits you from climbing up onto the platform. It's high enough above the sidewalk that you can't scale the wall, right? It's obviously under that portico that you enter, right? So I walk under the portico, and directly in front, that void that you see is a doorway, but there is a gate, a closed gate at that doorway. You can look through the gate and you'll see parking, okay? Obviously, there's parking on the ground floor of the building, but the gate's closed. You're not supposed to enter through the parking lot, right? Obviously, you have to go either to the left or to the right. To the left, there is this ramp, which will take you up to the platform. To the right, there's a staircase. The staircase seemed quicker to me, so I took a right and walked up the staircase. At the top of the staircase, you find yourself on that platform, and you can make out the cylindrical form of that central part of the entire complex. And you can also see the you can also see the ramp that will lead you through that opening. Obviously, that's where I'm supposed to go, right? And so on the model, you can see the way that the ramp sort of begins down in the lower right and then rises and will lead you through that arched opening that you can see in the image on the lower right. So I was walking, my cousin was right behind me, and I found myself on this low and leisurely ramp that sort of hugged the exterior of that central cylindrical form, and it took us all the way up around the cylindrical form and to the back. No doorway into the museum to be found, and next thing we knew, we were in the back of the complex. And I realized that I had gone that entire route and not found the front door into the gallery. And so I turn around and look at my cousin, and he's looking at me and he's shrugging his shoulders and he's not saying anything. You know, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? So I backtrack, walk all the way down that ramp, come back to the porch, start looking around, trying to find where the front entrance is, thinking I must have missed it, right? And indeed, I had missed it, because the front entrance is not visible from where the top of the stairs is. Rather, you have to go on the other side of that curved wall and behind the flat surface and under those little pitched roofs in order to find the main entrance into the gallery. Now, what's interesting about this? Well, first of all, I was following all of the architectural indicators that would tell me where I was supposed to go to enter into the building. That portico right at the front of the building, the ramp up to the central cylindrical form within the building. That central cylindrical form is obviously the destination, right? All of that was telling me that I was on the right path, and it led me to the back of the building. Sterling knew what he was doing here. Remember, one of the things that I said when we were taking a look at the engineering building at Leicester was that Sterling was interested in forms that communicate and details that communicate and how those can be used in a building to tell you about the use of the building. But he was also interested in circulation, how people move through buildings, and specifically for the engineering building, what are ways that you can have people encounter each other in the building in unexpected ways. Right? Here, he's going to continue to pay attention to circulation, and he's going to use architectural forms to communicate. And those architectural forms are coming from the tradition, the classical tradition, something that he saw in Schinkel's Altus Museum. Now, to be fair, Sterling was interested in allowing that circulation path, not only to toy with people like me, but also because behind the gallery is going to be urban space, which is going to be a terminal for a lot of public transportation. There are a lot of bus lines that end in the space behind the gallery. And so he also wanted to provide a way for people who got off the bus back there to actually walk to the front of the gallery space and to find their way to the front entrance. Nevertheless, even for them, if we sort of trace the path out, he's not giving them a clear indication of where the doors are into the gallery itself, because they're going to have to meander around that front porch up there and find their way to the front door on the other side of those curved glass walls. And so even for them, he's toying with them, right? You really have to explore this in order to find your way into the building. Once you get into the building, a lot of the gallery space is rather typical. He's not interested in creating a new experience from modern art the way that we saw Wright doing in the Guggenheim Museum, right? Rather, the gallery space here is all lined up with axial organization of the spaces. Most of the spaces are basic rectangular three-dimensional volumes, and he's very carefully controlling the light that comes in through these skylights. So once you get into the museum, um, the tricks and the jokes that he's playing on you sort of ends, right? He allows these spaces to be some rather typical gallery spaces. But if we take a look at some of the design decisions that he made for the outside of the building, we're going to see the way that he draws upon architectural history. I went into some length about the way that he drew upon a neoclassical museum, specifically Schinkel's Museum. But also on the outside of the museum, we're going to see a number of historical forms. Within the cylindrical center of the building, we can see that even though the pathway doesn't allow you, the pathway that rises up on that ramp doesn't allow you to actually connect with any of the interior space. We can see a little portico there that does provide access to some of the interior space. If we take a look at these views of the exterior of the building, we're going to see some historical references. In the upper left, if we take a look at the cornice detail there, that's a cavetto cornice, something that we can see in ancient Egyptian architecture. If we take a look at the geometry and the dimension and the proportion of the window there, we can see very tall, slender windows with the space ostensibly created by an arch, all of which refers to the sort of windows that we can see in Romanesque architecture from the early medieval period. If we take a look at the glass covering over the entryway into the museum itself, we're going to see glass and metal used in a ridge and furrow system, very much like we could see at the Crystal Palace, going back to Joseph Paxton's architecture. All of this is on a building where we've got this stonework, and all of this on a building where we've got these tubular steel handrails and structural elements colored these bright colors, which are obviously modern materials, mass-produced and used here on the building. And so he's sort of drawing from all these different historical moments and sort of throwing them together on the building itself. This is a great example of something that we can see in a lot of postmodern architecture, the use of these details in an architectural collage. Rather than trying to bring it together all in an integrated whole, rather designers are interested in just sort of throwing these things in the design and letting them exist on their own and not have any overall logic to the way that they were brought together in the design. A lot of it was done in a very joking manner. A lot of it was done in a very superficial and bad manner. But here in the Neue Staatsgalerie, we can see one of the better examples of that sort of architectural collage. But the jokes don't end there. The building itself is actually made of modern materials, and the stonework that we're looking at here on the building is just a stone revetment, meaning that these are thin, relatively thin panels of stone that are affixed onto a metal frame, which is the structure of the building. But in the podium upon which the porch and the rest of the building is accessed, he plays a joke in some parts. If we take a look at the central image down in the lower part here, we're going to see that it looks as if that stone revetment is actually blocks of stone. We imagine even load-bearing stone, and it appears that some of it has fallen out of place. And so we wonder about the structure of it. How is it that the blocks above are being sort of suspended there? But he's also joking with you. He's also saying, oh, but this is load-bearing stone walls, right? When it's not, right? It's actually just revetment. And so there's a sort of humor to postmodern architecture that we can see here in the Neue Staatsgalerie, in the use of the details and the use of the materials, and even in the way that the architectural elements are guiding you into and through the building. Now, postmodern architecture did not set out to be a classical revival. If we go back and think about that boilerplate definition for postmodernism, right, signs and symbols that Americans know and recognize from the architectural context, there's nothing there that necessarily screams classical revival. If you go out I-10, you're not going to see a lot of classical forms, right? But for Venturi, he saw a lot of classical allusions in the domestic architecture of the American suburbs. Right? Similarly with Stirling, right? There was a great neoclassical design that was an example of German museum architecture, and that was his point of departure. But there's nothing inherent in that boilerplate definition of postmodernism, nor anything really inherent in the text from Venturi that we read as the assigned reading for the class that says that it's got to be a classical revival. But what we end up seeing happening is a lot of these postmodern designers were drawing from the classical tradition because that's a tradition that people still knew how to read to a degree, right? In some ways, this still resonated with the American public, or with the German public for that matter. And so a lot of designers are going to use that as their starting off point. Another great postmodern design that we can take a look at is the design for an urban space in New Orleans called the Piazza d'Italia, which we're taking a look at here in these two images. It was designed by Charles Moore, a designer who did some very interesting modern architecture and had some very interesting ideas about architecture and urban form in the 1960s, 1970s. But here, he accepted a commission, and he decides that he's going to draw upon the classical tradition for a monument in New Orleans that was commissioned by the Italian-American community, Piazza d'Italia, right? Seems to make sense that classical forms would be the point of departure here. But if we take a look at what he's doing, we're going to see a number of the jokes that he's playing here. Throughout, you can see some sort of reduced down residual classical forms, but you can also see the way in which he's reinterpreting the classical forms. The Doric columns are no longer load-bearing stone, but they've been translated into chrome and sort of reduced down to their basic elements. If we take a look at the Corinthian capitals on the image to the right, we can see that the capitals are also worked out in chrome, and so necessarily much reduced down. Gone are all the fine carving that you could give to stone, but rather there are these surfaces that are achievable with chrome. If we take a look at the bottom of those engaged columns in the image to the right, we see that the engaged columns are standing on pedestals, but the pedestals appear to have the front shaved off of them, and they appear to be void. They appear to be thin exterior shapes that lack actual substance, which is playing a joke on you because those pedestals are supposed to be load-bearing. They're supposed to be bearing the weight of the columns or the engaged columns up above. But here, with the faces shaved off, they just appear to be voids. And what's happening above doesn't appear to be standing on anything substantial enough to actually support them. And if we move further to the right in the image on the right, we can see the way that the upper parts of the wall above the Serliana, above that combination of a little bit of trabeation, arcuation, and trabeation, have been removed. And then we've got all of this neon, which is sort of delineating the voids and delineating some of the architectural detail there. So a really joking, humorous, light-hearted use of the classical tradition, often in ways that are intended to be sort of nonsensical, all to sort of play with you, right? To sort of joke with you, to sort of get you to think about what is this supposed to be and how is this actually something that is antithetical to that. What's interesting about postmodernism is not these examples of drawing from what Americans know and recognize necessarily, but also the fact that postmodernism opened the door once again to architects looking at architectural history as things that people know and recognize and signs and symbols that people can read. And in turn, that opened the door to a full-blown classical tradition that began largely in the 1970s, 1980s, but that continues today. And there are some great examples of this classical tradition in design and also in urbanism. Here we're taking a look at a resort town on the coast of Florida called Seaside. And if we take a look at the planning of the community in the aerial view as well as in the plan over there, we can see the basic geometry. We can see axis and cross axis and diagonal axes that are worked out in the plan, all of which are drawing inspiration from the classical tradition. And if we come in and take a look at some of the buildings here, we're going to see, and there were some very strict building codes in place here, all of them draw from a tradition of domestic architecture in the United States, which has a link in one way or the other back to the classical tradition of England and to Italy. Some of these houses are just vaguely classical, but if you look around, you're going to see some full-blown classical elements here, such as the little centralized bandstand right in the middle of the public space in the illustration in the lower left. Or if we take a look at the uppermost part of the house in the extreme lower left of that same image, you're going to see a little temple-like form, which is set up as sort of a belvedere, sort of a high breezeway on the house to catch the breeze and to catch some of the views on in the neighborhood. So we're going to see sort of full-blown classical revival. Also in England, there were some designers who are interested in learning the classical tradition and designing both religious architecture, like we can see in the upper left, as well as domestic architecture in the upper right. And this in turn led to the establishment of some classical design academies once again. One of those design academies is affiliated with the University of Wales. One of them is at the University of Notre Dame outside Chicago, where they went back and they revived the classical method, the academic classicism of the Beaux-Arts educational method. And the young designers at Notre Dame and also at the institute affiliated with the University of Wales learn once again how to do freehand life drawing, to copy on 2 dimensions the plaster casts of ancient sculpture and ancient architecture. They learn how to use the architectural orders as proportional systems as well as architectural and structural forms. They learn how to render in ink wash and in watercolor wash. And so they learn these methods all as a way of building up to building design. And this was all possible because postmodernism opened the doors to looking at history once again and opened the doors to looking at the classical tradition once again. And Las Vegas, once again, leads the way for us. And if we go there today and take a look at some of the more contemporary architecture, we're going to see the ways in which some of the great historical architecture is being copied there quite literally. In this view, you might be able to make out the small-scale Paris Opera House, which is at the base of the Eiffel Tower, which is next door to the Louvre, a little bit of the palace, the Royal Palace in Paris, which has since been turned into the museum. You might see a bunch of great New York monuments, which have been recreated small scale, but also quite faithfully in a different sort of collage in Las Vegas. And if you go into Caesar's Palace, you're going to see how the classical tradition once again informs architecture. So beginning mostly in the 1960s, we can see this rising storm of critique of modernist architecture, where the general public, but also we begin to get architectural critics and even architects themselves who begin to think that architecture can do so much more than just provide a logical, straightforward solution with modern materials and a good structural system. They begin to think that architecture can tell people about the purpose of the building and that architecture can communicate. And from that, we get postmodern design, which then opens the door once again to historical revivals, including the classical revival. But never fear, modernist architecture continues well into the 21st century. And in the next lecture, we'll begin to take a look at examples of the continuity of modernism and how modernism continued through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century.